Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back into an era when beauty wasn't just an aspiration, it was a full-time occupation with very specific job requirements. We're talking about 1950s America, where every woman, whether she wanted to or not, was measured against a checklist of physical perfections so demanding it would make a modern wellness influencer weep into their green juice. This was the decade of the hourglass figure, the flawless complexion, and the unspoken rule that your worth could be calculated by waist circumference and the architectural integrity of your hairdo. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely want more of these strange historical deep dives where nostalgia meets mild horror. And a huge, sincere thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. Your ideas truly shape this channel and remind me that there are other people out there who find this stuff as fascinating and slightly unsettling as I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I know someone out there is 3 hours into a YouTube spiral at 2:47 AM, wrapped in a blanket like a nostalgic burrito, telling themselves this counts as self-improvement. Also, exciting news. This channel is now live on Spotify, so if you'd rather listen while falling asleep or doing literally anything else, the link is waiting for you in the description below. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that gentle white noise, wiggle yourself deep into your blankets, and get comfortable. Really comfortable. The kind of comfortable where moving feels like a betrayal. Because tonight we're exploring a time when women were expected to wake up looking camera ready, spend hours maintaining an appearance that seemed effortless, and smile graciously while being told their ankles were too thick for stardom. A time when beauty standards weren't suggestions, they were requirements, handed down by magazines, movies, and a culture that believed a woman's value could be measured in inches, pounds, and the precise angle of her eyebrow arch. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to live under those impossible standards? What did a woman see when she looked in the mirror in 1953? How many hours a day did she spend tweezing, curling, cinching, and painting herself into acceptability? Did she internalize those standards, or did she rage quietly against them while rolling her hair into perfect waves? What did it cost her, emotionally, physically, financially, to meet expectations that shifted like sand but somehow always stayed just out of reach? And what happened to the women who couldn't, or wouldn't, conform? And more importantly, could you have survived it? Could you have handled the girdles, the garter belts, the cold cream rituals, the calorie restrictions, the constant measuring, the endless primping, and the quiet, relentless message that your natural self wasn't quite enough? Well, congratulations. You've just woken up in 1955. Your mirror is waiting. Your girdle is hanging ominously on the closet door. A magazine on your nightstand is open to an article titled, "Are You Trying Hard Enough?" And somewhere in the distance a neighbour is already applying her third coat of lipstick. Good luck. Let's start with the shape, the silhouette. The measurement that mattered more than your personality, your intelligence, or your ability to parallel park. In the 1950s, the ideal woman had an hourglass figure so pronounced it looked like someone had photoshopped her waist into a different decade. 36-inch bust, 24-inch waist, 36-inch hips. These weren't aspirational numbers. They were requirements, spoken aloud by casting directors, whispered by mothers, printed in magazines as though they were universal truths rather than statistical anomalies. If your body didn't naturally curve in and out like a topographical map of desire, well, That's what foundation garments were for. The numbers themselves felt arbitrary, plucked from the air by someone who'd never actually inhabited a female body. Yet they carried the weight of a law, repeated so often in magazines, movies, and department store fitting rooms that they calcified into gospel. Dress sizes were designed around these proportions, sewing patterns assumed them. The entire fashion industry built itself on the premise that women's bodies should conform to this specific geometry, and if yours didn't, the failure was yours alone. You measured yourself constantly, or had yourself measured, standing in your bedroom with a tape measure pulled taut around your waist, your bust, your hips, comparing the results to the numbers you'd memorized from Vogue, from photoplay, from the back of the pattern envelope. The tape measure didn't lie, and its truth was often devastating. An extra inch at the waist felt like a moral failing. A bust that measured 34 instead of 36 suggested inadequacy. Hips that exceeded the magic number meant you were letting yourself go, losing control, failing at the one job women were supposed to perform effortlessly, being decorative. The hourglass wasn't just a shape. It was a symbol of femininity itself, the visual shorthand that announced you understood your role. Curves in the right places suggested fertility, desirability, health, but only if they appeared in precise proportion to one another. Too much curve and you were vulgar. Too little and you were boyish, unfeminine, in need of correction. The balance required was so specific, so narrow, that virtually no one achieved it naturally. But that didn't stop the culture from demanding it anyway. Women compared themselves to each other in powder rooms, at bridge clubs, in whispered conversations over coffee. Whose waist was smaller? Whose figure better approximated the ideal? The competition was quiet but relentless, a constant evaluation of who was winning at womanhood and who was falling behind. Even friendships carried this undercurrent of measurement, a subtle ranking system based on how closely each body matched the template, and if your body refused to cooperate, if your waist remained stubbornly thick or your hips disappointingly narrow, you learned to reshape yourself through force. Girdles, corsets, padding, wiring, the entire architecture of foundation garments existed to sculpt flesh into compliance. You strapped yourself in each morning, compressing, lifting, redistributing, until your silhouette matched what was expected, even if your actual body underneath bore no resemblance to the shape you projected. The cruelest part was how natural it was all supposed to look, as though you'd been born with a 24-inch waist, as though your body had simply decided on its own to curve in and out at mathematically perfect intervals. To reveal the scaffolding, to admit the effort, was to break the spell, to confess that you weren't naturally the woman you were pretending to be. So you measured, and you compressed, and you held your breath, and you hoped that today, somehow, the numbers would be kinder. The girdle was not optional. It was the scaffolding upon which respectable womanhood was built, a tightly woven prison of elastic, rubber, and societal expectation. You stepped into it each morning the way a knight steps into armour, knowing full well that comfort was not part of the bargain. The girdle smoothed, compressed, reshaped, and occasionally restricted breathing, but it delivered the smooth, streamlined silhouette that dresses of the era demanded. Without it, you were considered sloppy, unfinished, like a house with no foundation. Women wore girdles to the grocery store, to church, to lunch with friends, even on hot summer days when the elastic clung to damp skin like a polite torture device that society had collectively agreed to pretend was normal. Getting into a girdle required strategy, patience, and occasionally assistance. You couldn't simply pull it on like ordinary underwear. You had to ease into it, gathering the fabric at your ankles and rolling it up your legs inch by inch. the elastic resisting every upward movement as though personally offended by your thighs. Once you wrestled it past your hips, the real work began. Smoothing, adjusting, tucking, redistributing flesh into the compartments the girdle had designated for it. Your stomach flattened, your hips narrowed, your rear lifted slightly, reshaped into a rounder, firmer version of itself. The sensation was immediate and unmistakable. Compression. Everywhere. All at once. Not painful exactly, but constantly present. A firm embrace that never relaxed, never gave you a moment to forget it was there. Breathing required adjustment. You learned to take shallower breaths, expanding your ribcage just enough to function without fighting the girdle's grip. Deep sighs became impossible, bending at the waist required planning. And sitting was its own challenge. The girdle didn't bend the way your body wanted to bend. It held its shape stubbornly, forcing you to perch on the edge of chairs, spine straight, posture impeccable, not because you were naturally graceful, but because the girdle simply wouldn't allow slouching. You couldn't relax, you couldn't sprawl. You existed in a state of permanent corseted formality. In summer, the girdle became unbearable. Heat collected beneath the layers of elastic and fabric, trapped against your skin with nowhere to go. Sweat pooled in the small of your back, at the creases where the girdle dug into your flesh. You felt damp, sticky, imprisoned in your own undergarments, but removing the girdle in public was unthinkable. So you endured, dabbing your forehead with a handkerchief, smiling through the discomfort, pretending the heat didn't bother you. The girdle left marks, deep red indentations pressed into your skin, topographical lines that mapped exactly where the elastic had gripped you throughout the day. When you peeled it off at night, the relief was overwhelming, physical and emotional, a great exhale as your body expanded back into its natural shape. You could breathe fully again. You could bend. You could exist without constant compression reminding you to hold everything in. But the marks remained, fading slowly over the evening, a temporary record of the price you'd paid for a smooth silhouette. And tomorrow morning you'd step into it again, because that was simply what women did. The girdle wasn't about comfort. It was about control, about shaping your body into something acceptable, about meeting the standards that separated respectable women from those who'd given up. You wore it not because you wanted to, but because the alternative, appearing in public with your natural shape visible beneath your dress, was unthinkable. Your breasts in the 1950s were not merely anatomical features. They were architectural challenges requiring serious engineering, and the brassiere industry rose to meet them with the enthusiasm of rocket scientists designing spacecraft. Pointed, lifted, separated and projected outward at angles that defied both gravity and common sense, the ideal bust line resembled two ice cream cones trying to escape in opposite directions. The bullet bra, stiff with boning and stitching, transformed soft tissue into geometric precision. Padding, wiring, and strategic stitching could add inches where nature had been stingy. And if you were naturally well endowed, well, the bra still reshaped you, because the point wasn't to celebrate what you had, it was to conform to what was expected. The bullet bra was an engineering marvel and a physical mystery. How did something so rigid, so structured, so fundamentally uncomfortable become the foundation of feminine beauty? The illusion was the point. The work required to create it was meant to remain invisible. For women with larger busts, the bra became a harness, something designed not to enhance but to control, to lift and separate and contain, preventing natural softness from doing anything as undignified as moving or bouncing or existing without rigid supervision. The bra straps were wider, stronger, engineered to bear significant weight. The band was tighter, the structure more elaborate, the entire garment a feat of textile engineering designed to make your body behave. Regardless of your natural size, the message was the same. Your breasts, in their natural state, were inadequate. They required intervention, reshaping, enhancement or restraint, depending on what you'd been born with. The bullet bra promised to solve this problem, to transform whatever you had into what you were supposed to have, and you wore it daily, accepting the discomfort as simply another cost of being a woman. By evening, when you finally unhooked it and let it fall away, your skin bore the marks of its presence, red lines where the band had gripped, grooves where the straps had pulled, an aching tenderness beneath your arms where the wires had pressed all day. You massaged the sore spots gently, knowing that tomorrow you'd strap yourself back in and begin again. Because in the 1950s, your breasts weren't allowed to simply exist. They had to perform, and the bullet bra was their costume. Though the Victorian corset had officially retired, its spirit lived on in the 1950s, rebranded as the waist cincher, a garment that promised to carve your midsection into submission. Worn over the girdle but under the dress, the waist cincher pulled, squeezed and rearranged your internal organs into a configuration that prioritized appearance over function. Breathing shallowly became second nature. Sitting required strategy. Bending at the waist was a distant memory. But the reward, they said, was worth it. A waistline so small it could be encircled by a man's hands, a visual shorthand for femininity, desirability, and the kind of discipline that proved you cared enough to suffer gracefully. The waist cincher was narrower than a girdle, focused with laser precision on the midsection, wrapping around your natural waist and pulling inward with relentless determination. It fastened with hooks, sometimes dozens of them, marching up the front in a long line of tiny metal teeth that required patience and steady hands to close. Each hook tightened the garment incrementally, drawing the fabric tighter, the compression increasing with each fastening until you'd cinched yourself into a circumference several inches smaller than your body naturally occupied. The sensation was claustrophobic. Your ribcage felt caged. Your lungs operated in a reduced capacity, taking in just enough air to function, but never quite enough to feel satisfying. Deep breaths became impossible luxuries you'd abandoned along with comfortable waistbands. Yawning required conscious effort, a careful expansion that pushed against the cincher's unyielding grip. Eating while wearing a waist cincher was an exercise in strategic limitation. Your stomach, compressed and displaced, couldn't expand the way it wanted to. A few bites of food and you felt full, not because you'd eaten enough, but because there was simply nowhere for the food to go. Women picked at meals, claiming they weren't hungry, when really they were trapped in undergarments that made hunger irrelevant. The cincher made dieting mandatory, not through willpower, but through physical restriction. The waist cincher created the exaggerated hourglass silhouette that defined the era, the dramatic difference between bust and waist and hips that made dresses hang with that distinctive 1950s grace. Your waist, artificially narrowed, made everything else look fuller by comparison. Your hips seemed rounder, your bust seemed larger. The proportion shifted into something more extreme than nature ever intended, and that extremity was precisely the point. Fashion demanded it. The full-skirted dresses, the fitted bodices, the tailored suits, all of them were designed for bodies with impossibly small waists. Without the cincher, the clothes didn't fit right. They gaped at the waist, hung too loosely, lost their sculptural quality. The pressure to maintain the illusion infected relationships. Your husband, supposedly your intimate partner, was often complicit in pretending he'd married a woman who naturally woke up camera-ready. You rose before him to apply makeup, ensuring he never saw your bare, unmade face. You kept your foundation garments hidden, maintaining the fiction that your figure was simply that perfect without assistance. Some women wore makeup to bed, terrified of being seen without it even by the person supposedly closest to them, and underneath all of it, the quiet, persistent anxiety that if anyone discovered how much work was required, they'd realise you weren't actually beautiful at all, just skilled at fakery, just good at playing a part. The effortless beauty lie was perhaps the most damaging of all the beauty standards because it made the achievement of beauty feel like a test of your fundamental worth, your natural value, rather than simply a test of your ability to endure discomfort and follow instructions. Your face, in the 1950s, was supposed to resemble fine china, smooth, pale, luminous, utterly without flaw. Freckles were blemishes to be covered. Tans were signs of outdoor labour, decidedly unrefined. The ideal complexion was so fair it suggested you'd never once stood in direct sunlight without a parasol and a fainting couch nearby. Women scrubbed, bleached, and creamed their skin with products promising to lighten, brighten, and erase any hint of pigmentation. Cold creams, vanishing creams, foundation thick enough to spackle walls, it all served the same goal, to create a face so flawless it looked almost unreal, a porcelain mask of femininity that revealed nothing of the person underneath. The pursuit of pale perfection began each night with cold cream, thick white paste that you massaged into your skin with circular motions, dissolving the day's makeup and, theoretically, nourishing your complexion into alabaster radiance. The cream felt heavy, greasy, coating your skin in a slick layer that would remain until you wiped it away with soft tissues, each one coming away stained with foundation, powder, lipstick, the evidence of the face you'd worn all day. Then came the toners, astringents, clarifying lotions, liquids that promised to close pores, tighten skin, refine texture into something approaching perfection. They stung slightly, smelled medicinal, left your face feeling tight and clean. You patted them on with cotton pads, studying your reflection for any imperfection that needed addressing. A spot of redness, a small blemish, a freckle that had dared to darken. Bleaching creams promised to fade freckles, age spots, any pigmentation that disrupted the ideal of uniformly pale skin. You dabbed them on targeted areas, following instructions that warned about sensitivity, about avoiding sun exposure, about being patient as the melanin gradually faded. The creams smelled of chemicals and determination, and you applied them nightly, hoping that eventually your skin would achieve that coveted porcelain uniformity. In the morning came foundation, not the lightweight tinted moisturizers of future decades, but serious coverage, thick liquid or cream formulations designed to create a new surface entirely. Women carried parasols, wore wide-brimmed hats, stayed in the shade, applied sunscreen not to prevent cancer, which wasn't yet a major concern, but to prevent tanning, to maintain that pale complexion that signalled status and femininity. Beach trips required elaborate protection. Zinc oxide slathered on noses, long-sleeved cover-ups, strategic positioning under umbrellas. The irony, of course, was that all this effort to create flawless skin often damaged it. The heavy makeup clogged pores, the harsh cleansers stripped natural oils, the bleaching creams irritated sensitive areas. Women developed problems they then tried to cover with more products, creating a cycle of damage and concealment that never quite resolved. But flawless porcelain skin remained the goal, the standard against which all complexions were measured, and women bleached, creamed, powdered, and covered their way toward it day after day, believing that somewhere underneath all the effort was the perfect face they were meant to have. Makeup in the 1950s wasn't about self-expression. It was about correction, transformation, and the careful construction of an acceptable face. Foundation smoothed imperfections. Powder set everything into place with a matte finish that suggested you'd never once sweated in your life. Eyebrows were plucked into thin arched lines that conveyed perpetual surprise. Eyeliner flicked upward at the corners, widening the eyes into doe-like innocence. Mascara thickened lashes into dramatic frames. And lipstick, bold red lipstick, the finishing touch, a slash of colour that announced femininity, confidence, and the fact that you'd taken the time to paint your mouth into cultural compliance. The morning makeup ritual was extensive, methodical, performed before a well-lit mirror with an array of products that would seem excessive by earlier standards but was merely adequate by 1950s expectations. You began with a clean, moisturised face, the blank canvas, and proceeded through each step with the precision of someone following a recipe that couldn't tolerate improvisation. Foundation first, as always, smoothed across skin to create uniformity. Then concealer, dabbed under eyes to hide dark circles, pressed onto blemishes to erase them, blended carefully until the coverage was invisible. Powder came next, the great fixative, pressed and dusted until shine disappeared entirely and your face took on that matte, almost chalky finish that cameras loved and that suggested you existed in a climate-controlled environment where perspiration was simply not allowed. Eyebrows required their own extended tension. The natural brow, thick and undefined, was the before picture in every beauty transformation story. The goal was thin, highly arched, shaped with the precision of an architect's drawing. You plucked with tweezers, removing hair after hair, reshaping the brow into something that looked permanently surprised, permanently elegant, permanently feminine. Then you filled in the thinned brows with pencil, drawing the arch even higher, defining it even more sharply, until your face wore an expression of refined astonishment. Eyeliner was next, applied with a steady hand and considerable practice. The line began at the inner corner of the eye, swept along the lash line, then flicked upward at the outer corner in that distinctive cat-eye wing that defined the era. The flick had to be symmetrical on both eyes, a feat that required multiple attempts and occasional removal and reapplication. When done correctly, the effect was dramatic, widening the eyes, lifting them, creating a look that was both innocent and knowing. Mascara came in small cakes that you moistened with your breath or a drop of water, then brushed onto a tiny brush to apply. The application required patience, coating each lash individually, waiting for the mascara to dry slightly, applying a second coat for thickness, using a lash comb to separate any clumps. The goal was thick, dark, defined lashes that framed the eyes dramatically, and achieving it took time. Eyeshadow, when worn, was subtle, soft pastels that enhanced rather than dominated, applied in the crease and blended carefully. Too much eye makeup made you look cheap, fast, unsuitable for respectable society. The balance was delicate, enough to look polished, not so much that you look like you were trying too hard. Blush, or rouge as it was often called, added colour to cheeks that the matte foundation and powder had rendered nearly colourless. You smiled at the mirror to find the apples of your cheeks, then applied the blush in soft circles, blending until the colour looked natural, healthy, like you were gently blushing rather than wearing pigment. And then, finally, lipstick, the crown jewel of the face, the element that completed the transformation. But lipstick deserved its own extended ritual, its own careful attention, because in the 1950s, lips were everything. The makeup process took 30 minutes minimum, longer if you were being photographed or attending an important event. By the end, you looked at a face that was recognizable as yours, but improved, corrected, transformed into a more acceptable version. The person looking back from the mirror was you, but better, more feminine, more polished, more ready to face a world that expected women to arrive already perfected. Red lips weren't a choice, they were a requirement, the single most important element of a properly finished face. A woman without lipstick was a woman who'd given up, or so the culture whispered. The shade mattered. Too pink and you looked childish, too dark and you looked aggressive, too orange and you'd clearly lost your way. The perfect red, a blue-toned scarlet that flattered every complexion theoretically, had to be reapplied constantly. After meals, after drinks, after conversations, after simply existing for more than an hour. Women carried lipstick everywhere, a small artillery of colour tucked into purses, pulled out in powder rooms, applied with the precision of someone painting a tiny important sign that said, "I am trying." The lipstick itself was more than cosmetic, it was symbolic, a visible marker of femininity that could be read from across rooms. Your lips, painted red, announced that you'd made an effort, that you understood the rules, that you were participating in the collective performance of womanhood. To appear without lipstick was to signal illness, poverty, depression, or worse, a lack of respect for social conventions. The application required skill and practice. You started by outlining your lips with a lip pencil, defining the shape you wanted, sometimes slightly beyond your natural lip line to create the illusion of fuller lips. The outline had to be precise, symmetrical, creating a cupid's bow at the top and a smooth curve at the bottom. Then you filled in with the lipstick itself, applying it directly from the tube or with a lip brush for more precise control. The first coat went on smoothly, coating your lips in vivid colour. Then you blotted with tissue, pressing your lips together against the thin paper, leaving behind a perfect red lip print. The blotting removed excess product and set the colour. Then came the second coat, another layer of pigment that intensified the colour and ensured coverage. Sometimes a third coat, for events where your lips needed to last through hours of talking, drinking, eating. The final step was powder. Yes, powder on your lips, dusted lightly over the lipstick through a tissue to set it further, to create a matte finish that wouldn't transfer onto glasses, napkins, or anyone you might kiss. The powder created a slightly drier texture but increased the staying power significantly. But even with all this preparation, lipstick faded. It wore away at the centre of your lips where they pressed together. It transferred onto coffee cups, leaving perfect red crescents as evidence of your presence. It smudged slightly at the corners if you weren't careful, and so you checked constantly, pulling out a compact to inspect your lips in the tiny mirror, catching the fade before anyone else noticed, reapplying in bathrooms, at tables, in the car, maintaining the illusion that your lips were naturally this red, this perfect, this permanently painted. The reapplication became so automatic you barely thought about it. Pulling out the tube, swiping it across your lips, pressing them together, checking the result. Other women watched, noting your shade, your technique, silently evaluating whether you were maintaining standards or letting them slip. Lipstick mistakes were small catastrophes. Colour on your teeth was mortifying, a sign that you'd applied hastily or carelessly. Lipstick that feathered into the fine lines around your mouth aged you instantly, suggested you were losing the battle against time. A smudge at the corner made you look careless, unfinished, like you'd been interrupted mid-grooming. But the right lipstick, properly applied and maintained, transformed your entire face. It drew attention to your mouth, made your teeth look whiter, gave your complexion a lift. Red lips against pale skin created drama, contrast, a focal point that suggested confidence and sophistication. Women developed loyalties to specific shades, brands, formulas. They'd find their perfect red and buy it by the dozen, terrified it would be discontinued and they'd have to start the search again. The perfect red was personal, slightly different for everyone, and discovering it felt like unlocking a secret about yourself. And so you painted your lips every morning, carried the tube with you everywhere, reapplied dozens of times throughout the day, maintaining that slash of red that told the world you were a woman who cared, who tried, who understood that femininity required constant maintenance. Because in the 1950s, a bare lip was not just unfinished, it was unacceptable. Your eyebrows, those small strips of hair above your eyes that you'd probably never thought much about, became a battleground in the 1950s. The ideal brow was thin, highly arched, and shaped with the precision of a draftsman's line, a delicate curve that suggested perpetual elegance and mild astonishment. Achieving this required relentless plucking, tweezing out hairs one by one until your natural brow shape disappeared entirely, replaced by something drawn, painted, penciled into place each morning. Women stood before mirrors with tweezers, magnifying glasses and grim determination, pulling, shaping, perfecting, until their faces wore expressions of manufactured surprise that would last until the next round of maintenance. The transformation of your eyebrows began with destruction. Your natural brows, whatever their shape, were too thick, too straight, too low, too something. The ideal brow was thin enough to be delicate, but visible enough to frame the eyes, arched high enough to open up the face, but not so high that you looked cartoonish. Achieving this balance meant removing most of your natural eyebrow hair. You sat at your vanity with tweezers in hand, leaning close to the mirror, sometimes using a magnifying mirror to see individual hairs more clearly. Maintaining the brows required constant vigilance. Hair grew back, of course, and within days new hairs would appear, disrupting the clean line you'd created. You plucked every few days, sometimes daily, removing new growth before it became visible to anyone else. The routine became automatic, part of the daily grooming that never ended. And if you missed a day, if you let the plucking slide, if stray hairs became visible, people noticed. Other women particularly noticed, their eyes drawn to the small imperfection, the sign that you were slipping, that your grooming standards were declining. Some women overplucked, removing so much hair that their brows never grew back properly, leaving them dependent on pencil forever, drawing their brows on completely each morning because the natural hair simply gave up. Others plucked unevenly, creating brows that were sisters, not twins, constantly struggling to make them match. The eyebrow tyranny was exhausting, a small detail that consumed outsized attention. But in the 1950s, small details mattered. Your eyebrows weren't just hair, they were a signal, a test, proof that you were willing to endure discomfort and spend time on even the smallest aspects of your appearance. Because perfection, they said, was in the details. And in the 1950s, your eyebrows were under constant scrutiny. Hair in the 1950s reached for the heavens, literally. Volume was everything. Teased, sprayed, pinned, and sculpted into shapes that defied both gravity and reason. The higher your hair, the more effort you'd clearly invested, and effort in this era was currency. Rollers were your nightly companions, hard plastic cylinders you slept on like a bed of architectural discomfort. Hairspray, thick industrial strength aerosol clouds, shellacked everything into place, creating helmets of hair so rigid they could survive windstorms, rainstorms, and possibly minor earthquakes. To touch your hair was to risk disturbing the entire structure, and so you didn't. You simply carried your coiffure through the day like a fragile, flammable crown. The creation of 1950s hair began the night before, because hair this elaborate didn't happen spontaneously. You sat at your vanity after washing your hair, dividing it into sections with the precision of someone performing minor surgery. Each section was rolled onto a curler, pink or white plastic cylinders that came in various sizes depending on the curl you wanted, Small rollers for tight curls, large rollers for soft waves, medium rollers for everything in between. You rolled the hair methodically, section by section, securing each roller with a metal clip that dug slightly into your scalp. The process took half an hour or more, your arms aching by the end as you reached around to the back of your head, rolling blind, checking by feel to ensure each section was smooth and tight. By the time you finished, your head was covered in rows of rollers, a bumpy landscape that made you look like you were preparing for an alien invasion, rather than just trying to achieve nice hair. Then you tried to sleep, which was its own challenge. The rollers pressed into your scalp from every angle, creating pressure points that made finding a comfortable position nearly impossible. You shifted, adjusted, tried sleeping on your side, on your back, propped up on extra pillows to keep the pressure off the worst spots. Some women covered their heads with scarves or sleeping caps to keep the rollers in place. Others gave up on comfort entirely and simply endured, knowing that beauty required sacrifice, and that sacrifice often came in the form of sleepless nights on a pillow full of plastic spikes. In the morning, you woke tired and removed the rollers one by one, revealing tight curls that sprang out from your head in every direction. Your hair at this stage looked wild, unruly, nothing like the smooth waves you were aiming for. This was where the real work began. You brushed carefully, gently separating the curls, smoothing them into waves, teasing the roots to create volume. Teasing, or backcombing, involved taking small sections of hair and combing backward toward your scalp, creating tangles that added height and body. You teased until your hair stood away from your head in a bouffant or beehive or whatever style you were attempting, the volume building with each backward stroke of the comb. Then came the shaping, the smoothing, the careful arrangement of each wave and curl into its designated position. You used bobby pins to secure sections, creating the structure that would hold throughout the day. You smoothed the outer layer of hair over the teased sections, hiding the tangles underneath, creating the illusion that your hair was naturally this voluminous, this perfectly arranged. And then the hairspray, the final and most critical step. You held the aerosol can at arm's length and sprayed, coating your entire head in a mist of sticky polymer that settled over every strand, hardening as it dried, locking everything in place. You sprayed until the entire structure felt stiff, until you could wrap your knuckles on it and hear a faint hollow sound, until you were confident that wind, humidity, and time itself couldn't disrupt what you'd built. The result was magnificent and slightly terrifying. Your hair stood inches above your head, waves and curls frozen in permanent positions, the whole structure so solid it moved as a single unit when you turned your head. It was glamorous, dramatic, undeniably impressive. It also weighed more than your natural hair, pulled at your scalp and smelled perpetually of chemicals. Throughout the day, you didn't touch your hair. Touching risked disturbing it, creating dents or disrupting waves. And once disrupted, the structure was nearly impossible to repair without starting over. You moved carefully, avoiding low doorways, ducking slightly when passing under light fixtures, constantly aware of the architectural achievement balanced on top of your head. The hair lasted for days if you were careful, sleeping propped up to avoid crushing it, spraying it again each morning to reinforce the hold. Eventually, though, it would begin to droop, to lose its height, and you'd have to wash it all out and begin again, spending another evening with rollers digging into your skull. Because in the 1950s, flat hair was failure, height was success, and volume, achieved through discomfort, chemicals, and sheer stubborn determination, was the crown you wore to prove you understood the rules. The beauty salon in the 1950s wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. a temple where women gathered weekly to be transformed, maintained, and approved. You arrived with your natural hair and left with something sculptural, set into waves and curls that would hold for days under layers of spray and prayer. The salon smelled of chemicals, perfume, and quiet female solidarity. Women sat under hooded dryers, reading magazines that told them how to be better wives, better mothers, better versions of themselves. The stylist worked with the authority of a sculptor, shaping, teasing, pinning, spraying, until your head became a work of art you were terrified to disturb. The weekly appointment wasn't about vanity. It was about maintenance, upkeep, the relentless labour required to remain acceptable. You scheduled your appointment for the same time each week, a standing reservation that organised your entire schedule around it. Tuesday at 10, Thursday at 2, Saturday morning before the weekend began, whatever slot you'd claimed became sacred, inviolable, because missing your salon appointment meant facing the world with hair that was losing its structure, its height, its ability to signal that you were still trying. The salon itself was a world apart from the rest of your life. You stepped through the door and entered a space that smelled distinctly of permanent wave solution, setting lotion, and the particular floral perfume that salon owners seem to favour. The air was warm, slightly humid from the steam of washing stations and the heat of multiple dryers running simultaneously. Mirrors lined the walls, reflecting rows of women in various stages of transformation, some with wet hair being combed out, others sitting motionless under dryers, still others tilting their heads back over sinks while assistants scrubbed their scalps. The receptionist greeted you by name, checked you in with a penciled notation in her appointment book, and gestured toward the waiting area if your stylist wasn't quite ready. You sat in chairs upholstered in vinyl, flipping through magazines with titles like Ladies' Home Journal and McCall's, absorbing articles about casserole recipes, marriage advice, and the latest fashions you should already be wearing. Around you other women waited, some chatting quietly, others lost in their own reading, all of them complicit in this weekly ritual. When your name was called, you followed your stylist to her station, settling into the hydraulic chair that could raise and lower with a pump of the foot pedal. She draped a cape around your shoulders, snapping it closed at the back of your neck, transforming you into someone whose only visible parts were head and hands. She ran her fingers through your hair, assessing its condition, noting where the previous week's set had collapsed, where touch-ups would be needed. Then came the shampoo, a journey to the washing station where you leaned back until your neck rested in the curved porcelain basin. Warm water rushed over your scalp as the assistant worked shampoo into a lather, massaging your head with practiced efficiency. The sensation was pleasant, relaxing, one of the few moments in the beauty process that felt genuinely good rather than necessary. She rinsed thoroughly, applied conditioner if your hair was dry, rinsed again, then wrapped your head in a towel and guided you back to the styling chair. Your stylist combed through your wet hair, sectioning it methodically, then began setting it in rollers, the same process you'd attempted at home but executed with professional precision. She rolled each section tightly, secured it with clips, worked through your entire head until you bristled with pink plastic cylinders. Then she applied setting lotion, a liquid that would help the curls hold their shape, and guided you to the dryers. The hooded dryer was its own small torture chamber. You sat beneath it while she lowered the dome over your head, enclosing you in heat that blasted from all directions. The roar of the fan made conversation impossible, left you isolated in noise and warmth, your face growing flushed, your scalp tingling from the heat. You passed the time reading magazines you couldn't quite concentrate on, watching the clock, waiting for your stylist to check whether your hair had dried completely. When she finally released you from the dryer, your hair was set hard, the curls stiff and defined. She removed the rollers carefully, then began the back combing, the shaping, the smoothing, transforming the tight curls into the style you'd requested. Her hands moved with confidence, teasing here, smoothing there, pinning and arranging, until your hair rose into the proper height and held the proper shape. Finally came the hairspray, clouds of it, coating everything until your hair felt like a helmet. You examined the results in the mirror, turning your head from side to side, checking the profile, the back, ensuring everything was perfect. Your stylist stood behind you, awaiting approval, ready to adjust if needed. But usually it was perfect, or at least as perfect as hair could be. You thanked her, paid at the front desk, added a tip, and stepped back into the world with hair that would, if you were careful, last until your next appointment. The weekly salon visit was more than just hair maintenance. It was a social institution, a place where women gathered and shared the burden of beauty standards, where the labour of femininity was made visible and communal, where you could admit, if only silently, that none of this was actually effortless. Waves, curls, soft feminine rolls of hair cascading just so. These weren't things that happened naturally for most women. They were manufactured, painstakingly constructed each night with rollers, pins and products that smelled faintly medicinal. You sectioned your hair carefully, rolling each piece onto a hard cylinder, securing it with a clip that dug into your scalp. Then you slept, or tried to, your head a lumpy landscape of discomfort. In the morning, you unrolled carefully, brushed gently, and hoped the waves held their shape. If they didn't, you started over. If they did, you sprayed them into submission and carried them through the day like fragile, perfect secrets. The pursuit of waves began with understanding that your natural hair texture, whatever it was, wasn't good enough. Straight hair needed curling. Curly hair needed taming and reshaping into the right kind of curls, the soft, controlled waves that looked feminine rather than wild. Wavy hair needed enhancement, amplification, perfecting into more dramatic undulations. No one's natural texture was exactly right, which meant everyone needed intervention. You learned the technique through practice, through watching your mother, through instructions in magazines that showed cross-section diagrams of how to position the roller against your scalp, which direction to wind the hair, how to secure it without creating dents. The mechanics were simple in theory, but challenging in execution, especially when you were working on the back of your own head, rolling blind, your arms aching from being raised for so long. The size of the roller determined the size of the curl. Tiny rollers for tight spiral curls that you'd later brush out into small waves. Medium rollers for the standard wave pattern that worked for most styles. Large rollers for soft, sweeping curves that looked more natural, though natural was a relative term when your hair was wound around plastic cylinders and doused in chemical solutions. The rolling technique mattered. You had to pull the hair taut as you rolled, creating tension that would help the curl hold. You had to roll smoothly, without letting sections of hair escape or tangle. You had to position the roller flat against your scalp, not angled, to avoid creating strange bends in the wave pattern. And you had to secure it tightly enough to hold through the night, but not so tightly that it cut off circulation to your scalp. Setting lotion amplified the results. You applied it to damp hair before rolling, a thin liquid that smelled vaguely sweet and chemical, that would dry into the hair and help hold the curl longer. Some women swore by homemade solutions, sugar water or beer, though the commercial products worked better and didn't attract insects or leave your hair sticky. Then came the sleeping, which required compromise between comfort and curl preservation. You arranged your pillows carefully, trying to distribute the roller pressure across as many pillows as possible. You positioned your head to avoid crushing any particular section. Some nights you gave up on traditional sleeping positions entirely and propped yourself nearly upright, dozing fitfully in a semi-reclined position that spared your hair while torturing your neck. The morning reveal was always suspenseful. You removed the rollers one by one, watching each section of hair spring free, assessing whether the curls had set properly, or whether sections had dried unevenly, leaving some tight and others limp. Successful rolling produced uniform curls all over your head, a foundation you could work with. Failed rolling meant hot spots where the hair hadn't dried completely, or sections that had somehow escaped their rollers during the night, leaving straight pieces among the curled ones. If the rolling succeeded, you proceeded to styling, brushing through the tight curls to soften them into waves, arranging them with your fingers, pinning sections that needed encouragement to fall in particular directions. You worked slowly, carefully, because brushing too aggressively could turn waves into frizz, could destroy the curl pattern entirely and leave you with a puffy mess that resembled nothing you'd intended. The waves, once achieved, were precious. You moved through your day conscious of them, avoiding humidity that might cause them to droop, avoiding wind that might disturb their arrangement, avoiding any activity vigorous enough to make you sweat and loosen the curl pattern. You checked mirrors frequently, assessing whether the waves were holding or beginning to fall, whether touch-ups would be needed before evening. In photographs from the era, women's hair looks effortlessly wavy, glossy and perfect, cascading in soft curves that suggest hair naturally behaves this way. What the photographs don't show are the hours of nightly rolling, the uncomfortable sleep, the careful morning styling, the constant maintenance throughout the day. The waves weren't natural at all. They were architecture, carefully constructed and precariously maintained, another element of 1950s femininity that required endless labour disguised as effortless beauty. Your weight, in the 1950s, wasn't just a number, it was a moral judgment, a daily report card on your discipline, your worth, your ability to control the one thing women were told they could control, their bodies. The scale sat in bathrooms like a small judgmental oracle, delivering verdicts that shaped entire days. Too high a number and you were failing, indulgent, weak. The right number and you were virtuous, deserving, acceptable. Women weighed themselves obsessively, tracking fluctuations with the anxiety of stockbrokers watching markets crash. Gaining a pound felt catastrophic. Losing one felt like redemption. And the number itself, whatever the magazines claimed was ideal, always seemed to live just slightly out of reach, a moving target that kept women perpetually striving. The scale wasn't just furniture, it was a judge, jury, and sometimes executioner of your self-worth. You approached it each morning with a mixture of hope and dread, having already performed the pre-weigh-in rituals that every woman knew. Using the bathroom first, removing all clothing, even taking off your watch and earrings, because every ounce mattered. You stepped on carefully, centering your feet on the platform, holding your breath as though that might somehow influence the outcome. The dial swung, settled, delivered its verdict. You leaned forward to read it, sometimes having to adjust your position to see the number clearly, squinting at the tiny markings between pounds, and whatever number appeared became the truth of your day, the lens through which you'd interpret everything that followed. A pound lost was victory, validation, proof that your discipline was working, that the restricted eating and constant vigilance were paying off. You stepped off the scale feeling lighter, not just physically, but emotionally, as though the lower number had made you more acceptable, more deserving of taking up space in the world. The day ahead felt brighter, easier, like you'd earned some small measure of permission to exist. A pound gained was disaster, a failure that required immediate analysis and correction. What had you eaten yesterday? Had you indulged at dinner? Had that single cookie been the tipping point? You stepped off the scale feeling heavy with more than just the extra ounce, weighed down by shame and the immediate resolve to eat even less today, to compensate, to get back to the acceptable number as quickly as possible. The same number as yesterday brought relief mixed with disappointment. At least you hadn't gained, but you hadn't lost either, which meant your efforts were merely maintaining rather than improving. Maintenance felt like stagnation, like you were stuck, not progressing toward the ideal weight that magazines insisted you should achieve. Different scales told different stories, and you learned which ones were trustworthy and which ones seemed to add mysterious pounds. The scale at home versus the scale at the doctor's office, the scale at your mother's house versus the one at your sister's. Each had its own personality, its own tendency to be generous or harsh. You developed preferences, relationships with particular scales, trusting some and distrusting others based on whether their verdicts felt fair. You weighed yourself at the same time each day, usually morning before eating, in the same state of undress, trying to control all variables so that any fluctuation reflected genuine change rather than the weight of a glass of water or yesterday's dinner still working through your system. The routine became compulsive, necessary, a check-in with the most important measure of your acceptability. Some women weighed themselves multiple times per day, tracking fluctuations that happened naturally as they ate meals, drank water, went about their lives. The number would rise through the day as food and liquid added weight, then drop overnight as your body processed everything, resetting for the morning weigh-in. These fluctuations meant nothing medically but everything emotionally, each small increase registering as failure, each decrease as success. The scale also mediated your relationship with food. The morning number determined what you'd allow yourself to eat that day. A good number meant you could perhaps have a small dessert, could relax slightly. A bad number meant strict restriction, penance for the failure, punishment in the form of lettuce and deprivation. The tyranny was exhausting, this daily confrontation with a machine that reduced your worth to a single number, that ignored everything else about you, your intelligence, your kindness, your accomplishments, in favour of measuring only your mass. But you couldn't stop. The scale was the arbiter of acceptability, and in the 1950s, acceptability was everything. Some women eventually hid their scales or threw them away, or simply stopped weighing themselves, deciding that the daily judgment was causing more harm than good. But most continued the morning ritual, stepping on, holding their breath, reading the verdict, letting a number determine their emotional state for the next 24 hours. Because the scale didn't just measure weight, it measured worthiness, value, whether you were being good or being bad, whether you deserved kindness or deserved punishment. And in a culture that told women their bodies were never quite right, the scale was the constant reminder of how far you still had to go. Dieting wasn't something women did occasionally in the 1950s. It was a permanent state of being, a background hum of restriction that accompanied every meal, every snack, every momentary craving. Magazines overflowed with diet advice. Grapefruit diets, cottage cheese diets, hard-boiled egg diets, diets so restrictive they would horrify modern nutritionists. Women counted calories with the precision of accountants, measuring, tracking, denying themselves pleasure in pursuit of thinness. Desserts were enemies, bread was forbidden, butter was a moral failing, and hunger, persistent, gnawing hunger, was simply the price you paid for fitting into the dresses that defined womanhood. The assumption was that you were always on a diet, or should be. Even women who were already thin were encouraged to diet to maintain their thinness, to prevent the inevitable weight gain that supposedly lurked around every corner, waiting to ambush the careless woman who let her guard down. Dieting wasn't about reaching a goal weight and then stopping. It was about perpetual vigilance, constant restriction, never trusting your own appetite or your body's signals about what it needed. The diets themselves were wildly varied in their approaches but united in their misery. The grapefruit diet required eating half a grapefruit before every meal, the sour citrus supposedly burning fat through some mysterious metabolic magic. You choke down the bitter fruit 3 times a day, your mouth puckering, your stomach protesting the acid, all while eating tiny portions of everything else. The cottage cheese diet was exactly what it sounded like. Cottage cheese for breakfast, cottage cheese for lunch, cottage cheese for dinner, the bland, lumpy dairy product becoming both sustenance and punishment. Some versions allowed you to add a piece of fruit or a slice of tomato. Luxury items that felt extravagant after days of plain cottage cheese. The hard-boiled egg diet cycled through eggs with grapefruit, eggs with cottage cheese, eggs with lettuce, the same protein appearing in endless variations until you couldn't look at an egg without feeling slightly nauseous. The cabbage soup diet, the banana and milk diet, the nothing but black coffee and cigarettes diet. Each had its adherents, women who swore it worked, who'd lost 5 pounds in a week and looked nearly dead from malnutrition but definitely thinner. Calorie counting became a full-time occupation. You memorized the caloric content of every food, knew that an apple was 80 calories, a slice of bread was 70, a tablespoon of butter was 100. You added and subtracted through the day, keeping a running total in your head, or written in a small notebook you carried everywhere. The goal was usually 1,200 calories, sometimes less, a restriction severe enough that you felt hungry constantly, but not so severe that you'd collapse entirely. Measuring became mandatory. You couldn't just eat a serving of cottage cheese, you had to measure out exactly half a cup. You couldn't eyeball a piece of meat, you had to weigh it to ensure it was the prescribed 3 ounces. Kitchen scales and measuring cups were as essential as plates and forks, tools you used before every meal to ensure you weren't accidentally consuming more than allowed. The mental energy required was enormous. Every social invitation became a calculation. Would there be food? Would you be able to stick to your diet? Would people notice if you only ate the salad? Would they judge you for eating nothing? Food was no longer about nourishment or pleasure or social connection. It was about math, about control, about proving your discipline. Hunger became so constant you almost stopped noticing it, or convinced yourself you had. Your stomach growled through meetings, through lunches with friends, through afternoons at home. You learned to ignore it, to reinterpret it as success, as proof that the diet was working. The emptiness in your stomach became a perverse source of pride, evidence of your willpower, your commitment to remaining acceptably thin. Meals with other people were performances. You pushed food around your plate to make it look like you were eating more than you were. You cut things into small pieces and ate slowly, stretching out the meagre portions to last the entire meal. You claimed to be full after a few bites, your hand resting protectively over your plate to prevent anyone from offering you more. And when the diet inevitably failed, when you finally broke down and ate something forbidden, a piece of cake at a birthday party, a handful of crackers late at night, the guilt was crushing. You'd failed the diet, failed yourself, failed at the control you were supposed to have. The solution was always to start again tomorrow, to be stricter next time, to punish yourself with even greater restriction until you'd atoned for the transgression. The cycle was endless and exhausting. Restrict, fail, guilt, restrict harder, fail again. But stopping wasn't an option, because not dieting meant accepting your body as it was, and in the 1950s that acceptance was radical enough to be unthinkable. Thin was in, and not just thin, slender, delicate, willowy, as though women were meant to resemble elegant saplings rather than sturdy oaks. The ideal figure combined an ample bust and hips with an impossibly tiny waist, a combination that required either genetic luck or constant intervention. Women who were naturally thin were praised. Women who were naturally curvy were told to reduce. Women who were naturally solid were handed diet pills and shame. The culture worshipped slenderness with religious fervour, equating it with self-control, femininity and moral goodness, while quietly ignoring the hunger, the exhaustion, and the toll it took on bodies designed to carry more than just the weight of expectation. Slenderness wasn't just an aesthetic preference, it was a moral category. Thin women were assumed to be disciplined, controlled, virtuous. Their slenderness was read as evidence of character, proof that they possessed the willpower and self-denial that mark them as proper ladies. Heavier women, by contrast, were suspected of weakness, indulgence, a lack of the self-control that separated the respectable from the slovenly. Weight became a visible marker of invisible qualities, a way to judge women's character by their silhouettes. The cult of slenderness manifested in endless commentary on women's bodies, in public and private. Mothers monitored their daughters' figures anxiously, warning them at the first sign of weight gain that they'd need to be careful, to watch what they ate. Friends complimented each other's weight loss with a fervour usually reserved for major accomplishments. Strangers felt entitled to comment on women's bodies, offering unsolicited advice about dieting, exercise, or simply noting that someone had put on weight, as though this observation were helpful rather than cruel. Fashion reinforced the preference for slenderness relentlessly. The clothes of the era, the fitted bodices and full skirts, the pencil skirts and tailored suits were designed for bodies with specific proportions: small waists, flat stomachs, slender arms. Women who didn't fit these proportions found shopping agonizing, standing in dressing rooms as saleswomen suggested they try the diet department or perhaps shop elsewhere, their tone suggesting that the failure to fit the clothes was a personal failing rather than a design limitation. Models and actresses set the standard, their slender figures displayed in every magazine and movie, held up as ideals everyone should aspire to match. Never mind that these women had professional help maintaining their figures, personal trainers and studio dietitians, and sometimes amphetamines, prescribed by doctors who understood that staying thin was part of the job. Never mind that their images were often retouched to look even slimmer. They represented what was possible, what was expected, and every ordinary woman measured herself against them and found herself lacking. The preference for slenderness particularly targeted certain body parts. Arms should be thin, delicate, suggesting fragility rather than strength. Thighs should be slender, with a gap between them when standing, proof that you hadn't overindulged. Stomachs should be flat, perfectly flat, without even the slight natural curve that most women's bodies actually have. Faces should be narrow, with prominent cheekbones and defined jawlines, free from any softness that might suggest excess weight. The pursuit of slenderness took precedence over health, over energy, over basic well-being. Women dieted themselves into exhaustion, into dizziness, into anemia and malnutrition, and were praised for their discipline rather than offered concern about their obvious physical decline. Looking thin mattered more than feeling good, more than having the energy to function, more than the long-term consequences of chronic underfeeding. Diet pills became common, little pills prescribed casually by doctors who promised they'd help suppress appetite, help you lose weight faster, help you maintain the slenderness the culture demanded. The pills were often amphetamines, creating artificial energy and killing natural hunger, allowing women to function on minimal calories while feeling alert and capable. The side effects, the addiction, the long-term damage, these were considered acceptable trade-offs for achieving and maintaining slenderness. Some women's bodies simply couldn't achieve the slenderness demanded of them. Their frames were naturally broader, their metabolisms naturally slower, their genetics predisposed them to carry more weight. No amount of dieting or exercise would transform them into willowy sylphs. But this didn't stop the culture from insisting they try, from treating their natural bodies as problems to be solved rather than variations to be accepted. The cult of slenderness was particularly cruel to women as they aged. The metabolism that had allowed easy thinness in youth slowed with age, making maintaining the same weight increasingly difficult. Women fought desperately against the natural changes in their bodies, starving themselves more severely, exercising more obsessively, refusing to accept that bodies change and that those changes aren't failures. The worship of slenderness created a culture of comparison and competition, women constantly evaluating each other's bodies, ranking themselves and others, finding satisfaction only in being thinner than someone else. Friendships carried this undercurrent of body surveillance, conversations peppered with references to weight, dieting, clothing sizes, each woman seeking reassurance that she was acceptably thin while simultaneously gathering information about where others ranked in the hierarchy. And underneath all of it, the unspoken truth that slenderness, like all the other beauty standards, was less about aesthetics and more about control, about keeping women focused on their bodies, on restriction and discipline, rather than on the larger world they might otherwise have been engaging with. To eat with enthusiasm, to enjoy food openly, to reach for seconds or order dessert without apologizing. These were transgressions in the 1950s. Women were expected to eat daintily, sparingly, as though too much appetite suggested a lack of refinement. Meals became performances, small bites, frequent pauses, declarations of fullness after modest portions. In restaurants, women ordered salads, while men ordered steaks, the gendered division of hunger laid bare on every table. To admit you were still hungry was to admit you lacked control, and control, especially over the body, was the only power women were encouraged to wield. The performance of dainty eating began with portion sizes. You served yourself small amounts, much smaller than you actually wanted or needed, arranging the food carefully on your plate so it didn't look sparse, while still maintaining the appearance of moderation. A tablespoon of casserole, a few green beans, a small roll without butter. The portion suggested bird-like appetite, feminine restraint, the opposite of the hearty eating that characterized masculinity. Eating itself required deliberate slowness. You cut your food into tiny pieces, each morsel small enough to be ladylike, never so large that your mouth might stretch or your cheeks might bulge. You chewed thoroughly, far beyond what was necessary for digestion, prolonging each bite to make the small portion last longer. You set your fork down between bites, pausing, demonstrating that you weren't rushed or eager, that food didn't hold undue importance in your life. Conversation was meant to distract from eating, to fill the time between bites so that your slow pace seemed natural rather than calculated. You talked, laughed, listened to others, using the social aspects of the meal to disguise how little you were actually consuming. Meanwhile, your stomach might be growling, cramping with hunger, but acknowledging this would violate the pretense of delicate appetite. Finishing everything on your plate suggested greediness, so you left something behind, a few bites pushed to the side, visual proof that you'd eaten until satisfied rather than until the food ran out. Never mind that you were still hungry, that you'd gladly have eaten what you'd left if social rules permitted. The appearance of satisfied restraint mattered more than actual satiation. Seconds were impossible for most women, unless they were hosting, and taking another small serving appeared necessary for politeness. Even then, the second helping had to be tiny, accompanied by apologies and protestations. "Oh, just a tiny bit more. I couldn't possibly eat much. I'm already so full." The words created distance from the act of eating, suggested that you weren't really indulging, just being polite. Dessert was fraught with complexity. Accepting dessert too enthusiastically suggested poor discipline. Declining it entirely marked you as admirably restrained, but also risked seeming rude or overly concerned with your figure. The acceptable middle ground was accepting a small portion, eating half, and declaring it delicious but too rich to finish. This demonstrated both appreciation and control, enjoyment tempered by restraint. In restaurants, the menu options reflected and reinforced these expectations. The ladies' menu, when it existed, featured lighter items, smaller portions, more salads and fish, fewer steaks and heavy dishes. Women ordering from the regular menu, selecting heartier options, risked raised eyebrows or comments. The waiter taking orders often assumed women wanted salads, confirming orders with surprise when women requested anything more substantial. Men at the same table, meanwhile, ordered freely, ate heartily, requested seconds, finished everything, sometimes ordered additional sides, all without apology or restraint. Their appetites were natural, expected, celebrated. A man with a good appetite was vigorous, healthy. A woman with a similar appetite was concerning, unfeminine, potentially problematic. The contrast was stark and painful. You watched your dinner companion or your husband eating freely, enjoying the meal without the constant internal calculation you were performing, without worrying that each bite was being evaluated as evidence of poor character. The same act, eating, meant entirely different things depending on who was doing it. The shame attached to appetite extended beyond public meals into private ones. Women felt guilty eating alone, particularly if they were eating more than they'd allow themselves in company. Sneaking food, eating standing at the refrigerator, consuming leftovers quickly before anyone could see. These habits developed from the shame of having normal human hunger in a culture that told women their appetites should be minimal. Some women developed complicated relationships with food, eating heavily in private where no one could judge them, then restricting severely in public to maintain the appearance of dainty appetite. The split between public and private eating created its own shame, the feeling that you were living a lie, that your real appetite was something to hide. Children absorbed these lessons early. Mothers praised daughters who ate lightly, worried about daughters who asked for seconds, monitored growing girls' bodies and eating habits with anxiety. Boys were encouraged to eat heartily, to fuel their growing bodies. Girls were encouraged to restrain themselves, to stay small, to prioritize appearance over nourishment. The message was clear and damaging. Female appetite was dangerous, shameful, something to be controlled and hidden. Hunger wasn't a neutral biological signal, but a moral test, and giving in to it meant failing at femininity. Stand up straight, shoulders back, chin up, stomach in. The constant reminders echoed through childhood and followed women into adulthood, a litany of corrections designed to sculpt bodies into proper alignment. Good posture wasn't just about health, it was about presentation, about displaying your body in a way that maximized its appeal and minimized its flaws. Slouching suggested laziness, carelessness, a lack of feminine discipline. Walking required thought, heel-toe, hips swaying gently, arms loose but controlled. Sitting demanded crossed ankles, knees together, spine straight. Every movement was a small performance, a reminder that your body was never fully your own, always on display, always being judged by invisible audiences who'd internalized the same rules. The training began in childhood, mothers and teachers constantly correcting posture, physically adjusting girls' shoulders, touching their backs to remind them to straighten, tapping under their chins to lift their heads. The corrections were framed as being for your own good, teaching you habits that would serve you well in adulthood. But really they were about making girls' bodies more presentable, more pleasing to look at, more aligned with standards of feminine deportment. Books balanced on heads became a common training tool. The idea being that walking with a book on your head forced you to hold your neck straight, your spine erect, your movements smooth and controlled. You practiced walking back and forth across rooms, the book teetering precariously, threatening to fall with any misstep or slouch. The exercise was presented as preparation for elegance, for grace, for the poise that would mark you as refined. Good posture meant different things for different parts of your body, and you had to maintain all of them simultaneously. Your shoulders had to be back, not hunched forward, opening your chest and emphasizing your bust. Your spine had to be straight but not rigid, maintaining its natural curves while avoiding any hint of slouch. Your stomach had to be pulled in, held tight, creating a flat front that suggested you were constantly engaging your core muscles. Your pelvis had to be tucked slightly, avoiding any arch in your lower back that might make your rear protrude too obviously. Standing required constant awareness. You couldn't just stand naturally, weight distributed evenly, relaxed. You had to stand properly, weight slightly forward on the balls of your feet, knees straight but not locked, one foot perhaps slightly ahead of the other, in a pose that looked casual but was carefully constructed. Your arms couldn't simply hang at your sides, they needed to be positioned somehow, one hand perhaps on your hip, or holding a purse, or doing something that gave them purpose rather than just existing. Walking was even more complicated. The proper feminine walk involved stepping heel-toe, creating a smooth rolling motion rather than the flat-footed stride that came naturally to most people. Your hips were supposed to sway slightly, a natural consequence of the heel-toe motion, but not so much that you looked like you were exaggerating. Your arms swung gently at your sides, but not too much, maintaining controlled, graceful movement. Your head stayed level, avoiding the bobbing that came from ordinary walking. Stairs presented special challenges. Climbing stairs required even more posture consciousness, maintaining your upright spine while navigating steps, keeping your movements smooth and controlled. Descending was harder, requiring you to maintain elegance while managing the natural tendency to lean backward or grip the railing. You were supposed to glide up and down stairs as though gravity didn't quite apply to you. Sitting was its own elaborate protocol. You didn't just sit down, you lowered yourself gracefully, one hand perhaps smoothing your skirt as you descended, your spine remaining straight throughout. Once seated, your posture had to be maintained. Back straight, not leaning against the chair back unless absolutely necessary. Shoulders relaxed, but not slumped. Your knees had to be together, absolutely together, with your ankles crossed or tucked to one side. Sitting with knees apart was unfeminine, improper, suggestive of poor upbringing or worse. Your hands needed proper positioning too, resting in your lap, perhaps folded together, never fidgeting or picking at things. When eating, your elbows stayed off the table, your wrists resting lightly at the table edge, your movements controlled and delicate. Gesturing while talking required restraint, small, graceful movements rather than large, expansive ones that might seem dramatic or unfeminine. The constant vigilance was exhausting. You couldn't ever fully relax in public, couldn't let your body simply exist in its natural state. Every moment required awareness, adjustment, control. Your back ached from holding it straight. Your stomach muscles tired from being constantly engaged. Your neck felt stiff from keeping your chin at the prescribed angle. At home alone, you could finally slouch, letting your spine curve naturally, your shoulders roll forward, your stomach relax. The relief was physical and emotional, the sense of finally being able to inhabit your body without performing for invisible judges. But even at home, the habits were so ingrained that you sometimes caught yourself automatically correcting your posture, straightening your spine even though no one was watching. The posture requirements were ultimately about control and display. training women to hold their bodies in ways that made them more visually pleasing, while simultaneously reminding them that their bodies existed for others' viewing pleasure. Comfortable, natural posture wasn't acceptable because it prioritized the body's own needs over its decorative function. Proper posture sacrificed comfort for appearance, and that sacrifice, performed constantly and automatically, was simply another cost of being a 1950s woman. No respectable woman left the house without gloves and a hat, not in the 1950s. These weren't fashion choices, they were social requirements, visible markers of propriety and class. Gloves covered hands, protecting them from sun and dirt, but also signalling that your hands never touched anything unrefined. Hats perched atop carefully styled hair, completing the polished ensemble. Together they announced that you'd made an effort, that you understood the rules, that you took your role as a woman seriously. To appear in public bareheaded and barehanded was to suggest a casualness that bordered on vulgarity, a disregard for standards that marked you as lower class or simply careless. The gloves came in different weights and lengths for different occasions. Short gloves for daytime, reaching just to your wrist or slightly above, made of cotton or light leather. Longer gloves for evening or formal occasions, stretching to your elbow or even above, often made of kid leather so soft it felt like wearing a second skin. The colour mattered, white or cream for formal events, pastels for spring and summer, darker colours for fall and winter. The fit had to be perfect. Gloves that were too tight looked cheap, too loose looked sloppy. Putting on gloves was its own small ritual. You worked your fingers in one by one, smoothing the leather or fabric up over your hand, adjusting the seams so they sat straight, buttoning the tiny buttons at the wrist if the gloves had them. The gloves became a second skin, covering your hands completely, transforming them from working appendages into decorative elements of your outfit. Wearing gloves changed how you moved. Simple tasks became complicated. Opening your purse required more dexterity. Handling money felt clumsy. Touching anything became carefully considered because the gloves might soil or snag. You removed them for meals, for writing, for any task that required genuine dexterity, but put them back on immediately after, maintaining the proper covered state. The gloves also served as a barrier, a physical reminder that respectable women didn't touch the world directly. You shook hands through gloves, opened doors through gloves, held packages and purses through gloves. Your actual skin remained protected, untouched by the common surfaces that everyone else handled. This separation signalled status, suggested refinement, marked you as someone whose hands remained soft because they never engaged in actual labour. Hats were equally non-negotiable. You didn't leave home without something on your head, whether a small pillbox perched at an angle, a wide-brimmed sun hat for afternoon outings, or a close-fitting cloche for more casual occasions. The hat completed your outfit, yes, but it also signalled that you'd put thought into your appearance, that you understood that public presentation required full coverage from head to toe. Choosing the right hat required understanding complicated social rules. Church required specific hat styles, often more conservative and closer to the head. Luncheons called for fashionable but not ostentatious hats. Shopping trips meant practical hats that wouldn't obstruct your vision or get knocked off in crowds. Evening events required more dramatic hats, sometimes with veils or elaborate decorations. The hat sat atop your carefully constructed hairstyle, secured with hat pins that you push through the hat and into your hair, beneath, anchoring it firmly enough to survive wind and movement. The pins sometimes scraped against your scalp, a minor discomfort you ignored. The hat added weight to your head, changed your balance slightly, required awareness when passing through doorways or getting into cars. Together, gloves and hats formed a kind of armour, a layer of proper femininity that separated you from the casual, from the careless, From those who didn't understand or respect the standards, they signalled class status, marked you as someone who had the time and money to maintain proper appearance, someone who understood that being a lady required constant attention to detail. Removing them required its own protocol. You didn't simply yank them off casually. You removed gloves finger by finger, carefully preserving their shape. You removed your hat gently, mindful of not disturbing your hair beneath, placing it somewhere safe where it wouldn't be crushed or damaged. Both required care, respect for the objects that helped you maintain your social standing. The inconvenience was considerable, the expense non-trivial, the constant awareness exhausting. But appearing in public without gloves and a hat was unthinkable for respectable women, a social transgression that would mark you as ignorant of proper behaviour, careless of your reputation, unworthy of respect. Stockings in the 1950s came with seams, thin vertical lines running up the back of each leg, and those seams had to be straight. Perfectly, impossibly straight. A crooked seam suggested sloppiness, a woman who hadn't checked her appearance carefully enough before leaving the house. Women twisted before mirrors, craning their necks to inspect the backs of their own legs, adjusting, smoothing, straightening. Friends checked each other in powder rooms, offering quiet corrections. The seam was a tiny detail, nearly invisible at a distance, yet its straightness carried disproportionate weight, a small test of whether you cared enough to get even the invisible things right. The stockings themselves were fragile, delicate things made of nylon so fine it snagged on rough skin, caught on hangnails, developed runs from the slightest contact with anything sharp or rough. You purchased them carefully, checking for flaws, running your hands inside to feel for any irregularity in the weave that might cause premature failure. They came packaged individually, folded into small squares, and you opened each package with the reverence usually reserved for precious gifts. Putting them on required care and strategy. You gathered the stocking carefully, inserting your toes into the foot portion, then rolling the nylon up your legs slowly, smoothing as you went, ensuring no twists or wrinkles formed. When you reached the top, you attached the stocking to your garter belt, the elastic straps with metal or plastic clips that held the stockings up. Front garters first, clipped to the stocking's reinforced top, then back garters, which required reaching behind yourself and clipping blind. And then came the seam adjustment, the crucial final step. You twisted your leg, trying to see the back of it in your mirror or a reflection, checking whether the seam ran straight up the centre of your calf. Usually it didn't. Usually it twisted slightly to one side or the other, requiring you to rotate the entire stocking, pulling it carefully from the garter clips, adjusting the position, reclipping, then checking again. Sometimes this process repeated multiple times before both seams ran true. The seams had to be straight not just when you were standing still but throughout movement. Walking, sitting, crossing your legs, any motion could shift the stocking and send the seam wandering to the side of your leg. You developed a habit of checking throughout the day, running your hand down the back of your calf to feel whether the seam was still centered, ducking into bathrooms to check mirrors and make adjustments when needed. Other women checked your seams too, their eyes drawn automatically to the backs of your legs, assessing whether you had maintained standards. In powder rooms, women helped each other with seam adjustments, one holding up her skirt while another checked the line, adjusted the stocking rotation, confirmed that everything was straight again. This mutual grooming was both practical and social, a shared understanding that the standards were impossible to maintain alone. A crooked seam was embarrassing, not because it mattered functionally, but because it signalled carelessness or ignorance. It suggested you dressed hastily, that you hadn't bothered to check your appearance properly, that you didn't understand or care about the details that separated proper ladies from everyone else. The judgment was silent but real. Other women noting the crooked seam, cataloguing it as evidence of declining standards. The seams themselves were purely decorative, a holdover from earlier manufacturing methods that persisted long after they were technically necessary. Seamless stockings existed but weren't widely available and were considered less fashionable, less feminine somehow. The seam added visual interest, drew the eye up the leg, created a line that elongated and flattered. But it also created this endless maintenance requirement, this constant vigilance to ensure the line remained where it should be. Runs in stockings were minor disasters. A snag that turned into a run, the nylon unravelling in a line that crept upward despite your attempts to stop it with nail polish or soap, meant the stocking was ruined, unwearable, a loss that had to be absorbed and replaced. Women carried spare stockings in their purses for emergencies, knowing that a visible run was unacceptable, that appearing in public with damaged stockings suggested poverty or carelessness. The seam requirement was exhausting, one more detail in the endless list of details that defined proper feminine presentation. But like all the other requirements, it wasn't optional, wasn't negotiable. It was simply one more way that women's bodies and clothing had to be constantly monitored, constantly adjusted, constantly maintained to meet standards that seemed designed primarily to keep women focused on appearance rather than anything else. Heels weren't suggestions, they were requirements, the foundation, literally, upon which proper femininity was built. They added height, yes, but more importantly they changed posture, forcing the spine to arch, the hips to tilt, the legs to lengthen into more flattering lines. They also hurt constantly, a low-grade pain that women simply accepted as the cost of looking appropriate. Blisters formed and were ignored, toes cramped and were endured, ankles wobbled on sidewalks and were steadied through sheer determination. Flat shoes existed, of course, but they were for children, for the elderly, for women who'd given up. Everyone else clicked through their days on heels that promised elegance and delivered agony, smiling through it all because complaining would suggest you couldn't handle the basic requirements of womanhood. The heels of the 1950s weren't the stilettos of later decades, but they were still high, typically 2 to 3 inches, with a slim heel that concentrated your entire body weight onto a surface area smaller than a quarter. The physics were punishing. Your feet bore all your weight but did so unnaturally, tilted forward so that your toes carried most of the burden, compressed into the narrow toe box that tapered to a point because rounded toes looked frumpy and unfashionable. Getting dressed meant choosing which pain you'd endure that day. Different heel heights, different toe box shapes, different materials, each offered its own particular form of discomfort. The patent leather pumps looked elegant but didn't breathe, leaving your feet damp and slippery inside by afternoon. The suede heels felt softer initially, but offered no arch support, leaving your feet aching after an hour of standing. The spectator pumps with their contrasting toe caps were fashionable, but always seemed to rub at exactly the wrong spot, creating blisters at your pinky toes. You built up tolerance through sheer necessity, your feet developing calluses at pressure points, your muscles adapting to the unnatural position, your gait adjusting to accommodate the constant forward tilt. But the adaptation was never complete. The pain never fully disappeared. It became background noise, a constant low hum of discomfort you learned to ignore the way you ignored hunger or the tightness of your girdle. Walking in heels required concentration and modified movement. You couldn't stride naturally. Your steps had to be shorter, more measured. You couldn't run, couldn't really hurry at all without risking a twisted ankle or a broken heel. Stairs were treacherous, each step down requiring careful placement of your heel, ensuring the narrow point didn't slip off the edge. Uneven sidewalks, cobblestones, grates, gravel, grass, all presented hazards that forced constant attention to where you were placing your feet. The heels changed your entire body mechanics. Your calves tensed to maintain balance. Your thighs worked harder to propel you forward. Your core engaged to keep you upright. Your lower back arched in compensation for the forward tilt, sometimes creating an ache that travelled up your spine. By day's end, your whole body felt the effects of wearing heels, not just your feet. Blisters formed at friction points, the backs of your heels, the sides of your toes, anywhere the shoe rubbed against skin with each step. You felt them forming throughout the day, the initial tenderness that warned of trouble ahead, then the sharp pain as the blister fully developed, sometimes breaking open and bleeding into your stocking. You had remedies, bandages, moleskin, powder, but mostly you just endured, because changing shoes midday wasn't practical and wearing flats wasn't acceptable. Some days the pain became unbearable, impossible to ignore or push through. You'd find a place to sit, crossing your legs to take weight off your feet, flexing your toes inside the shoes to restore some circulation. In bathrooms, you'd slip the heels off for a few moments of relief, your feet screaming as blood flow returned, then force them back into the shoes because you couldn't walk out barefoot or in stockings alone. Men never seemed to notice or understand this discomfort. They complimented the heels, appreciated how they made women's legs look longer and more shapely, never acknowledging that this aesthetic improvement came at significant physical cost. The pain was invisible to them, and women didn't speak about it openly, maintaining the fiction that heels were simply normal, acceptable, fine. The cultural message was clear. Female beauty required suffering, and that suffering should be borne silently, gracefully, without complaint. Your feet hurt all day? That was just part of being a woman, like monthly cramps or restrictive undergarments. Another price you paid for being acceptable, desirable, properly feminine. By evening, when you finally removed the heels, your feet were swollen, red, marked with impressions from the shoe's interior. You massaged them gently, feeling the tender spots, assessing the damage. Tomorrow you'd put the heels back on and do it again, because flat shoes weren't an option, because heels were the foundation of proper appearance, because femininity apparently required your feet to hurt. Perfume wasn't optional in the 1950s. It was part of the uniform, a finishing touch that announced you'd completed your transformation from ordinary woman to properly groomed lady. Scents were floral, powdery, unmistakably feminine. Clouds of fragrance that entered rooms before you did and lingered after you left. To smell like nothing was to suggest you'd missed a step, that your grooming routine was incomplete. The perfume itself was expensive, or at least supposed to appear expensive, housed in elegant bottles that sat on vanities like small trophies. Women dabbed it on pulse points, behind ears, at wrists, on throats, layering scent like armour. A fragrant announcement that they'd tried, that they'd cared, that they understood the rules. The application was ritualistic, performed at your vanity each morning after makeup, after hair, after all the visible preparation was complete. You lifted the stopper from the bottle, a glass wand with a bulbous end that emerged glistening with liquid perfume. The scent hit you immediately, sweet and heady, promising sophistication and femininity in equal measure. You touched the stopper to your pulse points, those spots where blood ran close to the surface and body heat would warm the perfume, releasing its fragrance throughout the day. Behind your ears, where the scent would waft gently whenever you turned your head. The inside of your wrists, where every gesture would release another hint of fragrance. The hollow of your throat, that delicate dip at the base of your neck that drew eyes and would now draw them with scent as well. Some women dabbed perfume between their breasts, at the backs of their knees, even on their ankles, creating layers of scent that would reveal themselves gradually as they moved through their day. The bottle itself was part of the experience, designed to look beautiful on display, to signal taste and refinement even when sitting unused on your dresser. Cut crystal, frosted glass, ornate stoppers, each bottle was a small sculpture that suggested luxury. The more elaborate the bottle, the more refined the perfume supposedly was, though the correlation was often more marketing than reality. Still, you displayed your perfume bottles proudly, a collection that announced your sophistication to anyone who entered your bedroom. The scent you chose said something about you, or was supposed to. Floral scents, heavy with rose or jasmine or gardenia, suggested traditional femininity, the kind of woman who understood her role and embraced it. Powdery scents, soft and subtle, suggested refinement, good breeding, the kind of restraint that marked upper-class ladies. Oriental scents, heavier and more exotic, suggested sophistication and worldliness, though they risked being considered too bold, too sexual for truly respectable women. You wore the same perfume consistently, becoming known for it, until people associated that particular scent with you. It became part of your signature, your identity, the smell that lingered in rooms after you left and that people recognized as distinctly yours. Changing perfumes felt disorienting, like changing a fundamental part of yourself, and women often remained loyal to the same scent for years or even decades. The perfume had to be strong enough to be noticed, but not so strong it overwhelmed. Too much perfume suggested poor taste, an inability to judge appropriate amounts, lower-class origins where subtlety hadn't been taught. You learned the right amount through practice and feedback, noting when people leaned in and complimented your scent versus when they stepped back slightly, their noses wrinkling almost imperceptibly. Reapplication happened throughout the day, a small atomizer carried in your purse for touch-ups. You'd duck into bathrooms mid-afternoon and spritz more perfume, refreshing the scent that had faded through hours of wear. The ritual reinforced itself, the momentary cloud of fragrance reminding you that you were maintaining standards, keeping up appearances, remaining properly groomed even as the day wore on. The perfume mixed with other scents you carried, hairspray, powder, lipstick, the faint chemical smell of your foundation garments. Together they created a distinctly feminine cloud, a scent profile that announced your gender and your grooming habits before you spoke a word. This olfactory femininity was as important as visual femininity, another layer of the performance that had to be maintained constantly. Men wore cologne, but it was different, sharper, more astringent, less sweet. The gendered division of scent was clear and enforced, women smelling like flowers and powder, men smelling like leather and spice. To smell wrong for your gender was to violate an unspoken rule, to create confusion about who you were and what you represented. Some women developed headaches from their own perfume, the constant exposure creating sensitivity, but they wore it anyway because the alternative, smelling neutral, smelling human, smelling like nothing, was worse than the physical discomfort. The perfume was armor, protection, a scented shield that announced you were trying, that you cared, that you understood femininity required not just looking right but smelling right too. By evening, when you finally washed the day away, removing makeup and perfume together, the smell of soap felt almost stark, too clean, too plain. Your natural scent, whatever that was, had been buried so long under layers of perfume that you had almost forgotten what it was. You were more familiar with your perfume than with yourself, and that distance felt normal, expected, simply another aspect of being a woman in an era that required constant transformation. Youth in the 1950s wasn't just valued, it was worshipped, and its loss was mourned like a small death. Women were taught to fear aging from the moment they turned 25, that imaginary cliff after which they'd begin their long, tragic slide into irrelevance. Wrinkles were catastrophes. Grey hairs were emergencies. Any sign that time was passing, that bodies were aging, that life was happening, required immediate intervention. Anti-aging creams promised miracles. Hair dyes covered grey. Makeup concealed lines. Women fought time with the desperation of people who'd been told their value had an expiration date, and that date was always sooner than they'd hoped. The panic began early, sometimes in a woman's early 20s, when the first tiny line appeared at the corner of her eye, a fine crease that formed when she smiled and didn't quite disappear when her face relaxed. That line, barely visible, microscopic really, became an obsession. She'd examine it in the mirror each morning, checking whether it had deepened overnight, whether more lines had appeared nearby, whether this was the beginning of the end of her desirability. 25 became a deadline, an invisible line after which women were considered to be aging rather than young. Never mind that 25 was objectively still very young, that most women at that age were healthy, vital, at the peak of their physical capabilities. The culture had decided that youth ended in the mid-20s, and so women approached that birthday with dread, crossing over into a category that felt like failure. 30 was worse, the big 30 that magazines treated like a tragedy requiring sympathy and intervention. Women turning 30 received commiseration rather than celebration, their friends gathering not to mark another year of life but to mourn the loss of youth. The jokes were endless. Over the hill, past your prime, on the shelf. The underlying message was consistent and cruel. Your best years were behind you. Your value was declining. Your window of opportunity was closing. The beauty industry thrived on this panic, selling products that promised to reverse, delay, or hide the signs of aging. Creams with exotic ingredients, mysterious formulas that supposedly penetrated deep into skin to rebuild collagen, restore elasticity, erase years. You applied them religiously, morning and night, massaging them into your face with upward strokes that supposedly fought gravity's pull, following instructions that promised results if only you remained consistent and patient. The creams were expensive, packaged in small jars that suggested concentration and potency, priced to signal that quality anti-aging required investment. You bought them anyway, viewing them not as optional luxuries but as necessary weapons in the fight against time. The jars accumulated on your vanity, layering products: eye cream, night cream, throat cream, each targeting a specific area supposedly prone to aging. Grey hair was another catastrophe requiring immediate action. The first grey hair, discovered while brushing or styling, prompted either pulling it out immediately or, if there were too many to pull, an urgent appointment with your hairdresser for colour treatment. Grey hair signalled aging more visibly than wrinkles, was harder to hide, announced to the world that you were no longer young. Women dyed religiously, maintaining their natural colour, or sometimes choosing slightly lighter shades that they claimed looked more youthful. The touch-ups were constant, roots showing grey within weeks, requiring frequent salon visits, or at-home dye jobs that stained your hairline and sometimes your towels, but were necessary to maintain the illusion of unaging hair. Some women died so consistently, starting so early, that their children never saw their natural colour, growing up believing their mother's hair was naturally that shade of brown or blonde or auburn, unaware of the effort required to maintain the fiction. Makeup application shifted toward concealment as women aged. Foundation applied more heavily to cover any unevenness in skin tone, any spots or discoloration that suggested age. Powder settled into fine lines, sometimes emphasizing them rather than hiding them, requiring careful application and frequent blotting. Lipstick colours became more careful, avoiding shades that might make faces look older, sticking to tried and tested colours that had worked in youth. The clothing choices changed too, women abandoning styles considered too young for them, moving toward more conservative cuts and colours, accepting that certain fashions were for younger women, and that wearing them past a certain age made you look desperate or foolish rather than stylish. The transition felt like surrender, each shift toward more mature clothing, a small acknowledgement that youth was slipping away. The panic around aging was particularly cruel because it was inevitable. No amount of cream or dye or makeup could actually stop time, could actually prevent bodies from aging. The products and efforts only created the illusion of stop time, and that illusion required constant maintenance, constant vigilance, constant investment of time and money and emotional energy. Women were fighting a battle they couldn't win, and the culture insisted they keep fighting anyway, keep spending, keep trying, keep pretending that with enough effort they could remain 25 forever. The men around them aged without similar panic. Grey hair on men was distinguished. Wrinkles suggested character, wisdom, life experience. Men in their 30s, 40s, 50s were considered in their prime, their value increasing with age rather than declining. The double standard was obvious and painful, this gender difference in how aging was interpreted and valued. Some women eventually made peace with aging, stopped dyeing their hair, reduced their use of anti-aging products, accepted that growing older was natural and not something to fight desperately. But these women were often seen as having given up, as having surrendered to age rather than fighting it properly. The culture offered no graceful path to aging, no way to grow older that was celebrated or honoured. There was only the fight, the constant battle against time, the endless effort to remain young-looking in a world that had decided women's value expired with their youth. Movie stars, magazine models, beauty queens, these were the women held up as ideals, their images plastered across every available surface as proof of what was possible, what was expected, what you too could achieve if only you tried hard enough. Never mind that these women had professional makeup artists, personal trainers, studio lighting, and retouching. Never mind that their jobs required them to maintain appearances ordinary women could never afford. Never mind that many of them were miserable, starving, and exhausted beneath their perfect facades. They were the standard, and every real woman measured herself against these impossible paragons, finding herself inevitably lacking, perpetually behind, never quite enough. The stars stared out from magazine covers, their skin impossibly smooth, their figures impossibly perfect, their hair impossibly glossy. These images papered your world, unavoidable reminders of what beauty was supposed to look like. You saw them at newsstands, in your own magazines at home, in advertisements on billboards and in store windows. The faces changed, but the message remained constant. This is what women should look like, and anything less is failure. The beauty queens made it worse, real women supposedly. Girls next door who'd won competitions through some combination of genetics and grooming that proved beauty was achievable if you just worked hard enough. They smiled from newspaper photographs, sashes across their chests, crowns on their heads, living proof that perfection existed. The fact that they had been selected from thousands of entrants, that they represented statistical outliers rather than attainable standards, went unmentioned. They were presented as normal girls who'd simply tried their best. Movie stars were the ultimate standard, their images larger than life, literally, projected onto screens where every pore, every hair, every imperfection would be visible if they existed. But they didn't exist because the stars had access to resources ordinary women couldn't imagine. Full-time makeup artists who attended to their faces before every scene, hairstylists who maintained their elaborate coiffures, costume designers who fitted their clothes to perfection, lighting technicians who knew exactly how to illuminate them to hide any flaws. The stars also had contracts that required them to maintain specific measurements, weight requirements written into their studio agreements, mandatory weigh-ins and measurements to ensure they remained within acceptable parameters. They had studio dietitians who planned their meals, trainers who supervised their exercise, doctors who prescribed pills when diet and exercise weren't enough. Maintaining their appearance was their full-time job, supported by teams of professionals and enforced by legal obligations. But none of this was visible to the women viewing the finished product. You saw only the perfection, the flawless faces and figures, and assumed that if only you tried harder, restricted more, applied makeup better, styled your hair more carefully, you could look like that too. The gap between their resources and yours remained invisible, leaving you to conclude that the difference was simply that they were naturally more beautiful, more disciplined, more deserving. The photographs themselves were lies, retouched to remove any remaining imperfections the makeup and lighting had missed, airbrushing smooth skin, removed blemishes, erased shadows under eyes. Sometimes entire features were altered, waists narrowed, legs lengthened, proportions adjusted to be more pleasing. But viewers didn't know this, didn't realize they were comparing themselves to images that had been manipulated, that represented ideals no actual human could achieve because they weren't fully human anymore. They were paintings pretending to be photographs. The comparison was inescapable and devastating. You looked at the stars and then at yourself, seeing only the gap, the distance between their perfection and your flawed reality. Your skin had pores, blemishes, uneven tone. Your figure didn't match the hourglass ideal no matter how tightly you cinched your waist. Your hair didn't hold its style as perfectly, didn't shine as glossily. Every difference felt like a personal failing, evidence that you weren't trying hard enough, weren't disciplined enough, weren't good enough. The stars' personal lives, when they became public, sometimes revealed the cost of maintaining these appearances. Stories of nervous breakdowns, hospitalizations for exhaustion, divorces, addictions. These occasionally slipped through the studio publicity machine and suggested that perhaps perfection came at a price higher than most people realized. But these revelations were quickly buried, dismissed as aberrations, and the perfect images continued to flow, setting standards that damaged every woman who tried and inevitably failed to meet them. Young girls grew up surrounded by these images, absorbing from childhood that this was what women should look like, that beauty had specific parameters and anything outside them was unacceptable. They learned to judge themselves before anyone else could, internalizing the standards, making the criticism automatic and internal rather than external. By the time they were teenagers, the damage was done, the impossible standards fully integrated into their self-conception. The few women who came close to meeting these standards faced their own problems, the pressure to maintain perfection, the knowledge that their value was tied entirely to appearance, the fear of aging or gaining weight or any change that might diminish their looks. Their beauty became a burden, something that had to be constantly protected and maintained, that defined them so completely that everything else about them disappeared. The impossible standard setters created a system where no woman could win. The most beautiful were trapped by their beauty, the less beautiful were tormented by their failure to measure up, and everyone was reduced to bodies, to faces, to measurements, to surfaces rather than depths. The standards weren't aspirational, they were destructive, and they shaped an entire generation of women who learned to see themselves as perpetually inadequate. The exhaustion of living under these standards, the daily, relentless pressure to measure up, weighed on women in ways that rarely got acknowledged. You couldn't simply exist. You had to perform existence perfectly, maintaining your figure, your face, your hair, your wardrobe, your posture, your pleasantness, your patience, all while making it look easy. The mental load was crushing, a constant background calculation of whether you were doing enough, being enough, looking enough like the women in magazines to deserve the life you'd been promised. And when you fell short, as everyone inevitably did, the failure felt personal, a character flaw rather than a systemic impossibility. The pressure began the moment you woke, that first glance in the mirror assessing overnight damage. Had you slept on your hair wrong? Was there a new wrinkle? Did your face look puffy? The mental checklist started before you were fully conscious, cataloguing what needed correction, what required extra attention, what problems had developed while you slept that would need addressing before you could face the world. Breakfast became a calculation rather than nourishment. How many calories had you allocated for this meal? Could you afford to eat at all, or should you save those calories for later when eating might be more socially necessary? You measured portions, added totals, balanced the need for energy against the requirement to remain thin, making choices that left you hungry but acceptably sized. Getting dressed required decisions that seemed simple but carried weight. Which girdle, which bra, how much compression could you tolerate today? Which outfit made you look most acceptable, most appropriately feminine, most aligned with current fashion while still flattering your particular figure? Each choice mattered, each had consequences, and choosing wrong meant a day of feeling uncomfortable or inappropriately dressed or simply wrong in your own skin. The makeup application, the hairstyling, the final adjustments, all performed while the clock ticked toward your departure time, the pressure mounting to finish, to get it right, to achieve the polished look that suggested this had all been effortless. You rushed while trying to appear calm, knowing that signs of haste, of stress, would undermine the illusion of natural beauty you were trying to create. Then the day itself, hours of maintaining what you'd created, checking mirrors frequently to assess whether anything had slipped, whether your makeup needed touch-ups, whether your hair was still holding its shape, whether your stocking seams remained straight. The vigilance was constant and exhausting, this need to monitor your appearance continuously, because any lapse would be noticed, would be judged, would be catalogued as evidence of declining standards. Social interactions added another layer of pressure. Were you smiling enough? Too much? Was your voice pleasant, feminine, not too loud or too assertive? Were your gestures graceful, your posture proper? You performed femininity in every moment, constantly aware of how you were being perceived, constantly adjusting based on feedback subtle and overt, constantly trying to thread the needle between too much and too little of everything. Meals with others became stages where you performed dainty eating, proper appetite, feminine restraint. You couldn't simply enjoy food, you had to demonstrate appropriate relationship with it, eating enough to be polite but not so much that you seemed to lack control. The performance made meals stressful rather than pleasurable, social occasions to navigate rather than enjoy. The comparison was constant and inevitable. Other women became both mirrors and measuring sticks, their appearances assessed automatically, their successes and failures at meeting standards noted and compared against your own. Were they thinner, better dressed, more polished? The competition was rarely explicit but always present, this constant ranking and re-ranking of who was winning at womanhood. The pressure extended beyond appearance into behaviour, into personality, into every aspect of how you moved through the world. You were supposed to be pleasant always, smiling, agreeable, supportive. Negative emotions had to be hidden or expressed only in acceptable ways, tears that were delicate rather than messy, frustration that remained polite rather than angry. Your authentic feelings, whatever they were, had to be filtered through the requirements of femininity before they could be expressed. The exhaustion accumulated day by day, year by year, this constant performance with no breaks, no days off, no permission to simply exist without judgment. You went to bed tired not just from the day's activities, but from the day's vigilance, from the constant monitoring and adjusting and maintaining that femininity required. Sleep became not rest, but simply the intermission before tomorrow's performance began again. Some women cracked under the pressure, developing anxiety, depression, eating disorders, or simply profound exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. Some found themselves crying without clear reason, the accumulated pressure finally overflowing in ways they couldn't control or explain. Some numbed themselves with alcohol or pills, seeking relief from the relentlessness of the standards. Others developed coping mechanisms, small rebellions, tiny spaces where they allowed themselves to exist without performing. Moments alone where they could slouch, where they could eat without calculating, where they could let their faces rest in natural expressions rather than maintained pleasantness. These stolen moments of authenticity became precious, brief respites from the exhausting performance of perfection. But the pressure never fully lifted, never allowed women to relax into themselves completely. The standards were always there, always measuring, always finding them wanting, always demanding more effort, more discipline, more sacrifice in the pursuit of an ideal that remained perpetually out of reach. The promise was that achieving perfection would bring happiness, acceptance, love, but the reality was that perfection was impossible, and the pursuit of it consumed everything, leaving women exhausted, diminished, and still somehow believing that if only they tried harder, they might finally be enough. So tonight, as you settle deeper into your blankets, the soft kind, not the scratchy wool studio issue ones celebrities used to pretend were luxury, let's take a breath and look back at the glittering, exhausting world you just survived. You woke up in a mansion with more rooms than emotional stability. You endured diets made of grapefruit and sorrow, girdles that rearranged your internal organs, and beauty routines so elaborate they required architectural planning. You smiled through it all, through the measurements and the judgments and the endless clicking of paparazzi flashbulbs, and somehow, impossibly, you made it to the end of the day with your carefully constructed hairdo mostly intact. The 1950s sold a vision of perfection, polished and gleaming, where every woman was supposed to wake up looking like a movie still, and spend her day floating through immaculate rooms in immaculate clothes with an immaculate 24-inch waist. But underneath all that glitter were real women, human women, who ached and hungered and adjusted their girdles in bathroom stalls and wondered if anyone else felt this tired. They weren't failing at perfection, they were surviving standards designed to be unachievable, and that survival took a kind of strength that rarely got acknowledged. For all the impossible beauty standards, for all the pain and restriction and relentless judgment, there were also moments of quiet beauty. The ritual of the weekly salon, women gathered under dryers, sharing space and silent understanding. The friend who checked your stocking seams in the powder room, offering help without judgment. The moments when the performance dropped and real connection happened despite everything working against it. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, maybe whisper a soft thank you to every woman who cinched herself into a girdle at dawn, who smiled through hunger, who spent an hour on her hair just to leave the house, who believed that all this effort might earn her acceptance, love, a place in the world. Thank them for enduring what they endured, for surviving standards that would break most of us, for carrying the weight of impossible expectations with whatever grace they could muster. And maybe take something small from this era forward with you. Not the girdles, definitely not the girdles. But perhaps the understanding that the pressure to be perfect is ancient, that women have always fought these battles, that you're not alone in feeling like you're never quite enough. Perhaps the knowledge that resistance has always existed too, quiet and scattered but real, women choosing comfort over conformity, authenticity over performance, carving out small spaces where they could simply breathe. History may remember the 1950s for its glamour, its movies, its carefully constructed images of feminine perfection. But the real story is smaller, more human, found in the moments between the photographs, in the relief of removing heels at the end of the day, in the friend who understood without words, in the quiet decision to keep going despite everything. Tonight, you get to rest without performing. You get to exist without an audience. You get to be imperfect, comfortable, human, and that is a privilege women in 1955 rarely had. So breathe deeply. Let your body relax into its natural shape. Let sleep find you gently. Good night, and may your dreams be kinder than the beauty standards ever were.